"Whoever goes in there dies," said the little girl in front of the locked warehouse, but the millionaire decides to enter. And when he opens the door, he discovers something shocking. Comment telling me what you thought of this story, giving it a score from 0 to 10, and comment what city you're watching me from. I really want to know if you liked my story, and I want to get to know you better, so subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The biting August wind swept through the Port District of Baltimore as Charles Blackwood adjusted the collar of his suit jacket against the dry chill. At 52, the businessman had built an empire based on precision and absolute control. Every property he acquired underwent his personal inspection, every detail catalogued in his meticulous mind. The warehouse before him represented the final piece of a project that would transform that industrial area into a modern logistics complex. The oxidized iron structures rose like skeletons against the grey sky, echoing Charles's firm steps on the cracked concrete. 170,000 square feet of opportunity awaited his final approval. The numbers danced in his head: profit margin, construction schedule, return on investment, everything calculated, everything predictable. It was then that he heard the voice. Small, almost a whisper carried by the wind between the metal beams. Charles stopped abruptly, his muscles tense. 40 years of business experience had sharpened his instincts, and something in that childlike voice triggered a primitive alarm in his chest. He followed the sound through the labyrinth of structures, past abandoned machines covered in torn tarps. The smell of rancid oil and rusted metal permeated the air, mixed with the distant aroma of damp earth that announced rain. The girl was crouched between two beams, her tangled dark hair falling over her thin face. She wore a faded pink dress, too small for her frail body, and worn plastic shoes that barely protected her feet from the cold. Upon noticing Charles's presence, she raised her eyes, large, dark, filled with a sadness that seemed too old for her 4 years. "Mister," she said, her voice trembling but determined, "you can't go in there." She pointed to a welded metal door at the back of the warehouse, her small, dirty hands shaking slightly. "Whoever goes in there dies." Charles felt a knot in his stomach. The child spoke with the seriousness of someone who had witnessed horrors no person should ever know, much less such a small girl. But there was something else in those eyes, something familiar he couldn't quite place. "Where are your parents?" he asked, crouching to her level. The girl looked down, nervously fiddling with a loose thread on her dress. "Mommy went away. She said she'd come back, but—" Her voice broke, and she bit her lower lip to hold back tears. Charles observed the child more closely. Despite the dirt and tattered clothes, there was a delicacy in her features, a subtle education in the way she expressed herself. This was no ordinary street kid. There was a story behind this situation, and Charles Blackwood could never resist a mystery. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Lily," she replied, finally looking up again. "And you can't go in that door. It's dangerous." Charles's obsession with control flared. In all his properties, in all his businesses, he had never found a room he couldn't access, information he couldn't obtain. The idea of a sealed door in a warehouse he was about to buy was unacceptable. "Why is it dangerous?" he insisted, but Lily just shook her head, backing away a few steps. "Mommy said so. Mommy always talked about the door that doesn't open." The words came out like a haunted whisper. Charles approached the metal door. The weld was old but sturdy, clearly made to keep something or someone permanently locked away. He pulled out his cell phone and called Frank Thompson, his caretaker and trusted man for over a decade. "Frank, I need you to bring tools to cut through a weld. I'm at the Port District warehouse. Boss, isn't it better to wait for the technicians to arrive tomorrow?" The caretaker's worried voice came through the line. "Now," was Charles's curt reply. While he waited, he turned his attention back to Lily. The girl had hidden behind a pile of wooden crates, only her large eyes visible between the gaps. There was fear there, but also curiosity, as if she herself wished to know what was behind that door, despite knowing the dangers. "How long have you been here?" Charles asked, trying to keep his voice gentle. "A long time," she answered vaguely, "since Mommy went away." "And when was that?" Lily frowned, clearly struggling to piece together fragmented memories. "Before the cold, before the big rains." Her words were too precise for such a young child, as if she'd been trained to observe and remember. Frank arrived half an hour later, carrying a toolbox and a worried expression on his dark, wrinkled face. At 60, the caretaker knew Charles well enough to know when it was useless to argue, but his eyes widened when he saw Lily. "Mr. Blackwood," he murmured, "this girl, she looks like..." "Like who?" Charles turned sharply, catching something in the caretaker's tone. "Nothing, boss. Just reminded me of someone." Frank averted his gaze, focusing on preparing the cutting torch. Cutting the weld took 40 minutes. Lily watched from a distance, biting her dirty nails, muttering words Charles couldn't quite understand. When the door finally gave way, a stuffy, heavy air escaped from within, bringing with it the smell of old paper and something vaguely chemical. Charles pushed the door hard, revealing a small, dark room. Frank lit up the space with a flashlight, revealing piles of documents, an old computer, and several boxes stacked against the walls. It was clearly a makeshift office, kept secret for years. "Don't go." "In there." Lily's voice sounded desperate behind them, but Charles had already crossed the threshold. His curiosity had overcome any caution. That's when he heard the metallic clang that chilled his blood. The door had slammed shut violently, triggered by a spring mechanism that had activated with the weight of its opening. Outside, Frank was pulling on the door, shouting instructions that echoed faintly through the metal. But the industrial lock had engaged, sealing Charles inside the claustrophobic space. And he wasn't alone. Lily had entered with him, her eyes now shining with a strange mix of terror and resignation. "I told you," she said simply. "Now we're going to be trapped, just like Mommy said would happen." Charles's heart raced. The air in the room seemed thicker with each breath, and the reality of his situation began to crystallize in his mind. He was trapped in a space of less than 100 square feet with a 4-year-old child, not knowing if Frank could open the door or when that might happen. "Lily," he said, forcing calm into his voice, "tell me about your mommy. What did she do here?" The girl curled up in a corner, hugging her, knees to her chest. "Mommy used to come here with Uncle Oswald. They talked about important papers. Mommy was always sad afterward." The name hit Charles like a punch. Oswald Fraser, his accountant for 15 years, the man he trusted absolutely to manage the finances of all his companies. "Uncle Oswald? He always brought me candy," Lily continued, her voice growing softer. "But then Mommy would cry. She took pictures of the papers he brought secretly. She thought I didn't see, but I always see everything." The girl's words echoed in the confined space, like revelations rewriting everything Charles thought. He knew about his life. The air seemed even thinner as he processed the implications. Oswald, the man who signed his checks, who knew every penny in his accounts, had held secret meetings with a woman and a child in this hidden place. Outside, Frank's shouts gradually faded as he likely went to get help. But Charles knew it would take hours to get the right tools to cut through the industrial lock. Hours trapped in that ever-shrinking space, with a child who held secrets that could destroy everything he had worked for. Lily began to hum quietly, a sad melody that echoed off the metal walls. And as he listened, Charles felt something shifting in his chest, a painful recognition that this child was not just an accidental discovery, but a key to mysteries he didn't even know existed in his own life. The first day in the sealed room passed like a slow-motion nightmare. Charles tried to stay calm while Lily dozed in a corner, wrapped in her own t-shirt. The businessman explored every inch of the confined space, mentally cataloguing everything he found. The documents scattered on the tables revealed fragments of a disturbing puzzle. City contracts with his company, Blackwood Constructions, but with figures he didn't remember negotiating, overpriced invoices for materials he had never purchased, and most shockingly, detailed reports on the Hope Foundation, the charity he had run for 5 years, showing systematic embezzlement of funds meant for social projects. Uncle Oswald always said it was for the good of the children, Lily murmured, waking up as she heard Charles flipping through the papers. Mommy didn't believe him. "What was your mother's full name?" Charles asked, feeling a knot grow in his stomach. "Beatrice Morgan," the girl replied without hesitation. "She worked at a big company. She always wore nice clothes and talked on the phone about numbers." The name struck Charles like lightning. Beatrice had been his personal secretary for 3 years, a competent and discreet woman who organized his schedule and had access to confidential information about all his businesses. She had resigned abruptly 2 years ago, citing personal problems she never fully explained. "Lily," he said softly, crouching down to the girl's level, "did your mother ever tell you where she worked?" The child shook her head. "She just said she worked for an important man who built big houses. Sometimes she cried when she got home." The pieces began to fall into place in Charles's mind. Beatrice had discovered Oswald's scheme, probably through documents that passed through her hands, but instead of reporting him, she had started investigating on her own, photographing evidence and meeting secretly with the accountant in that makeshift office. "Uncle Oswald always brought presents," Lily continued, pulling a battered doll from under a pile of papers. "This doll was Mommy's when she was little. Uncle Oswald said Mommy wanted me to have it." Charles took the doll, noticing something strange about its consistency. It felt heavier than normal, and there was a small, uneven seam on its back. "May I see?" he asked, and Lily nodded. Carefully, he opened the seam. Inside the stuffing, he found a small digital recorder and several memory cards. His hands trembled as he realized he was holding evidence that Beatrice had collected, likely at the risk of her life. "Mommy always said that one day I would understand why she kept secrets inside the doll," Lily said, watching him with her big eyes. "She said that when I grew up, I would find someone good who would help." The second day brought thirst and a growing claustrophobia. Charles rationed the little water left in a forgotten bottle on the table, giving most of it to Lily. The girl seemed strangely adapted to the situation, as if she had been confined before. "Mommy sometimes locked me in the closet when Uncle Oswald came to our house," she revealed casually while playing with scraps of paper. "She said it was to protect me from the grown-up talks." "What kind of talks?" Charles asked, though he suspected the answer. "He always talked about money that disappeared and money that appeared. Mommy recorded everything on her phone, secretly. Then she would cry a lot." Lily paused, as if organizing fragmented memories. "Once I heard him talking about a lady with long hair who was going to take Mommy to a safe place." Charles's blood ran cold. "What lady?" "I don't know her name, but she always wore perfume that smelled like the flowers at the cemetery, and she had a really big black van." During the second night, Charles managed to activate the recorder he had found in the doll. The voices that emerged from the small device painted a terrifying picture of the betrayal that had grown under his nose for years. Beatrice's voice, tense and whispering, "Oswald, you can't keep doing this. Mr. Blackwood is a good man. He doesn't know anything." Oswald's response, cold and calculating. "Beatrice, you don't understand the complexity of the situation. There are many more people involved than you imagine, including people very close to your boss." "Who else knows about this?" "His sister Carmen runs the foundation. She knows exactly where every diverted cent goes. Father Joseph also gets his silent cut. It's a network, Beatrice, and you're in the middle of it now. Charles felt his world crumble as he heard his sister's name. Carmen had taken over the administration of the Hope Foundation when he was too busy with business expansion. He had trusted her completely, never questioning her decisions or checking the financial reports she presented. "And if I tell him everything?" Beatrice's voice trembled on the recording. "Then you'll meet Dr. Nadine. She has a very discreet clinic in Annapolis where people with memory problems receive specialized treatments. Some patients get so confused they even forget their own names." The silence that followed was cut by Beatrice's muffled sobs. "My daughter," she murmured. "Your daughter will be safe as long as you cooperate. But if you decide to be a hero, well, accidents happen to small children too." Lily had fallen asleep leaning on Charles's shoulder as he listened to the recordings. The small, warm weight of the child against his chest awakened something he had buried for decades, the memory of his own lonely childhood in Baltimore's orphanages, the hunger for protection and affection he had never found. On the third morning, Frank finally managed to break the lock. The light that flooded the room temporarily blinded Charles and Lily, who emerged from their confinement like survivors of a shipwreck. The caretaker was accompanied by 2 workers and brought water, food, and a palpable relief on his wrinkled face. "Boss, I tried everything," Frank said, helping them out. "The lock was completely jammed. We had to cut the whole hinge." Charles watched the caretaker's face closely as Lily ran to hide behind the stacks of crates. There was something in Frank's eyes, an emotion that seemed to go beyond professional concern. "Frank," he said slowly, "did you know Beatrice Morgan?" The caretaker hesitated for a split second, long enough to confirm Charles's suspicions. "Yes, boss. She was a good girl." "Was? Is? She is a good girl," he corrected himself quickly. "I heard she moved far away." Charles picked up the doll Lily had dropped and watched Frank's reaction. The man turned visibly pale at the sight of the toy. "This doll belonged to Lily's mother," Charles said, testing him. "Interesting how some things from the past persist, don't you think?" Frank looked away. "Yes, boss. The past sometimes comes back to haunt us." On the way home, with Lily sleeping in the back seat of his car, Charles made decisions that would change his life forever. First, he would confront Oswald and find out exactly how far the corruption in his companies extended. Second, he would find Beatrice, no matter the cost. And third, he would protect Lily from anyone who tried to use her again. But as he drove through the familiar streets of Baltimore, observing the city he had helped build through his ventures, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Cars that seemed to follow him at a distance, faces that appeared with suspicious frequency in his rearview mirrors. The game had begun, but the rules were far more complex and dangerous than he had imagined. And at the center of it all, a 4-year-old girl who carried in her eyes the weight of secrets that powerful men would kill to protect. When he arrived home, Charles carried the sleeping Lily to the guest room, covering her carefully with a clean blanket. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of responsibility for another human life. He didn't know yet that at that very moment, Oswald Fraser was in an urgent meeting with people who preferred to remain in the shadows, discussing exactly what to do with a businessman who was too curious and a child who knew things she should never have seen. The confrontation with Oswald Fraser happened on a September morning, when the first rains of the season wet the windows of the Blackwood Constructions office. Charles arrived earlier than usual, finding his accountant already settled in the meeting room, surrounded by piles of financial reports that seemed to have been hastily prepared overnight. "Charles, good thing you're here," Oswald said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his small, calculating eyes. We need to talk about some irregularities I discovered in the last few days. Irregularities? Charles closed the door behind him, locking it discreetly. Interesting that you mention that. Oswald was a harmless-looking man, short, bald, with gold-rimmed glasses that gave him the air of a retired professor. 15 years working together had created a professional intimacy that Charles now realized had been completely illusory. "Sit down, Oswald," Charles said, pulling up a chair to face the accountant. "Tell me about Beatrice Morgan." The change in Oswald's expression was almost imperceptible, but Charles had spent decades reading faces in negotiations. He saw the flash of panic the man tried to disguise by adjusting his glasses. "Beatrice, your old secretary? What about her?" "Where is she, Oswald?" "How would I know? She quit and disappeared. I thought you knew." Charles pulled the digital recorder from Lily's doll and placed it on the table. "Want to try again?" The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Oswald stared at the small device as if it were a venomous snake ready to strike. His hands began to tremble slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Charles pressed play. Beatrice's voice echoed through the room, followed by Oswald's cold response about the clinic in Annapolis and the veiled threats against the girl. The accountant gradually paled until his face turned a grayish color. 15 years, Oswald," Charles said when the recording ended. "For 15 years I trusted you with everything, my company, my foundation, my personal finances." "You don't understand the complexity of the situation," Oswald replied, using the exact same words from the recording. "There are larger forces at play here, Charles. People you can't even imagine." "Then explain it to me." Oswald took a deep breath, like a man about to confess crimes he had carried alone for years. "It started small. A few thousand here, 10,000 there, from the foundation's accounts. It was to cover temporary deficits for the city." "Deficits?" "Mayor Michael Sanders needed funds for emergency projects. He promised to pay it all back with interest when the state funding came through." Charles felt his stomach churn. Is Michael Sanders related to Beatrice? Distant cousin. That's how she found out about the scheme. The mayor mentioned to her at a family party how you were collaborating with the city administration. The puzzle pieces continued to fall into place, painting a terrifying portrait of corruption that had grown like a cancer through his organizations. "And my sister Carmen?" "Carmen discovered the diversions when she took over the foundation's administration, but instead of reporting it, she decided to use some of the money to pay for her autistic son's treatments. The specialized therapies cost a fortune." Charles closed his eyes, feeling the weight of each revelation. His 8-year-old nephew, Raphael, had been receiving expensive treatments since he was 3, when he was diagnosed with severe autism. Carmen had always claimed the health insurance plan covered everything. And Father Joseph? The priest knew the money came from questionable sources, but he believed he was doing good. The social projects he runs truly help hundreds of families. He turned a blind eye to the origin of the funds. "How many people know about this?" Oswald hesitated, then sighed in resignation. "Besides us, Dr. Marcus Ribeiro, the city's comptroller, Dr. Nadine Vance, who runs the clinic where Beatrice is, and Jack Fisher, the businessman who supplies overpriced materials for the construction projects." "Is Beatrice alive?" "She is, but not as you remember her." Charles's blood ran cold. "Explain." "When she threatened to expose everything, Dr. Nadine suggested a temporary solution. Beatrice was admitted under a false identity, diagnosed with a psychotic break. The medication she receives, they alter her memory. You drugged an innocent woman to protect a corruption scheme. It was to protect all of us, including you, Charles. If she had talked, your company would have been destroyed, your reputation, your employees, everything." Charles stood up abruptly, walking to the window. Down below, in the reception area, he could see Lily playing with some colored papers the secretary had given her. The girl had adapted surprisingly well to the office routine, as if she had finally found the stability she had been missing for so long. "And now?" he asked without turning. "Now you have to choose," Oswald replied, regaining some of his composure. "You can expose everything and watch your empire crumble, destroying the lives of dozens of families who depend on your jobs. Or you can accept that sometimes we have to make difficult choices for the greater good." The greater good. The social projects keep running. Families in need receive help. Your nephew continues to receive treatment. Beatrice is safe and cared for in an excellent clinic. And Lily? What greater good justifies leaving a 4-year-old child an orphan? Oswald didn't answer. Charles turned and saw that the accountant was typing something on his phone. "What are you doing?" "Warning them that the situation has become complicated," Oswald replied coldly, "that it might be necessary to take more drastic measures." Charles snatched the phone from the accountant's hands and read the unsent message. "He knows everything. The child too. We need to accelerate the timeline." Timeline for what? Before Oswald could answer, the office door burst open. Frank entered unceremoniously, carrying Lily in his arms. The girl was crying, and the caretaker had a desperate look on his face. "Boss, we need to get out of here now," Frank said urgently. "2 black cars just pulled up downstairs. Men in suits are coming up." Charles looked out the window and saw the vehicles parked in front of the building. Through the tinted windows, he could make out silhouettes waiting inside the cars. "Who are they?" he asked Oswald. "People who solve problems for other people," the accountant replied with a coldness that made Charles realize he was facing a stranger. "You should have left things as they were." Frank put Lily down and positioned himself between her and Oswald. "Mr. Blackwood, there's an emergency exit via the fire escape. My car is parked in the back lot." "How did you know they were coming?" Charles asked, but Frank just shook his head. "I'll explain later. We need to go now." As they headed for the door, Oswald stood up. "Charles, you're making a mistake. They won't give up easily, and there are things about Frank that you don't know." "What things?" Frank stopped at the threshold, turning slowly. "Beatrice is my daughter," he said simply, "and I've spent the last 2 years planning how to get her out of that clinic." The ensuing silence was cut by the sound of heavy footsteps coming up the main staircase of the building. Lily grabbed Charles's hand, her big eyes fixed on the caretaker who had just revealed himself to be her grandfather. "Grandpa Frank?" she murmured, and the man knelt to hug her. "Yes, little one. Grandpa's here now." Charles processed the revelation as the footsteps grew closer. Frank was not just his loyal caretaker. He was the father of the woman who had been destroyed by a scheme he had unwittingly financed. And now they were all trapped in a web of lies and corruption that threatened to destroy everything Charles had worked for. "The emergency exit," he said, picking Lily up. "Now." As they ran down the hallway toward the fire escape, Charles heard Oswald shouting behind them, "You can't run forever. They have resources, they have influence. They'll find you wherever you hide." But Charles had already made his decision. No matter the cost, he would find Beatrice, dismantle the corruption scheme, and protect Lily, even if it meant losing everything he had worked for his entire life. The escape through the back alleys of Baltimore lasted for 3 tense hours, with Frank guiding them through routes only he knew. The caretaker's old truck traveled down dirt roads until it reached an abandoned warehouse on the industrial outskirts, far enough from the city center to offer temporary safety. Lily slept leaning against Charles, exhausted by the stress of the last few days. "Now you're going to explain everything to me," Charles said when they finally stopped. "From the beginning." Frank sighed, the lines on his face seeming deeper in the dim light of the warehouse. Beatrice is the daughter from my first marriage. Her mother died when she was 17, and I wasn't a good father. I was always working, trying to support the house on my own. How did she end up working for me? She graduated with a degree in business administration, got the job at your company on her own merit. I never interfered, never mentioned our relationship. I wanted her to achieve things on her own. Frank paused, watching Lily sleep. When she got pregnant at 22, the child's father disappeared. Beatrice raised Lily alone, working hard to give the girl stability. And when did you find out about Oswald's scheme? She came to me in desperation. She said she had discovered something terrible involving you and the foundation, but that she was sure you didn't know anything about it. She knew your character, your honesty. Frank got up, walking to a dirty window. We planned together how to gather enough evidence to expose Oswald without destroying your reputation. But something went wrong. Oswald found out she was investigating. He threatened her directly, said he had enough influence to make her and Lily disappear forever. Frank's voice broke slightly. Beatrice was terrified. She quit her job hoping he would leave her alone. Charles vaguely remembered Beatrice's last week at the company. She had seemed nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder, avoiding eye contact. At the time, he had attributed her behavior to the stress of changing jobs. How did she end up in the clinic? Oswald didn't give up. He kept pursuing her, demanding she hand over all the evidence she had collected. When she refused, they kidnapped her one night when she was coming home from a friend's house. Frank clenched his fists. Lily was with me when it happened. I brought her home, but the next day I discovered that men were watching my house too. That's why you hid her in the port warehouse. It was the only safe place I knew. A friend lent me the key, said no one had been there for years. Frank turned back to Charles. I visited Lily every day, brought her food, clean clothes, but I couldn't take her out of there without exposing our location. And Beatrice? Did you know where she was? Frank's face lit up with an expression that mixed pain and hope. I spent 2 years investigating. I found out about the clinic in Annapolis, about Dr. Nadine, and the treatment she was receiving, but I also discovered something Oswald didn't know. What? Beatrice has been pretending to be sedated for the last 6 months. She stopped taking the medication, faking a vegetative state while planning an escape. She's perfectly lucid, just waiting for the right moment. Charles felt a wave of relief and admiration. How did you know this? Dr. Edward Marks, a psychiatrist at the clinic who was suspicious of Beatrice's diagnosis. He started replacing her medication with placebos, helping her gradually regain her lucidity. Frank smiled for the first time since they had met. Edward is a man of integrity who suspected from the beginning that something was wrong with her admission. Lily woke up slowly, rubbing her small eyes. Grandpa Frank, where are we? In a safe place, little one, and I have a surprise for you. The three of them left the warehouse as the sun began to set, painting the sky in orange hues that reflected in the rain puddles in the parking lot. Frank led them to a shipping container that looked abandoned at the back of the lot, but was carefully camouflaged among piles of scrap metal. When he opened the container door, Charles's breath caught. Beatrice was sitting on a makeshift bed, visibly thinner than he remembered, but with her eyes shining with intelligence and determination. Upon seeing Lily, she stood up quickly, rushing to embrace her daughter. "Mommy!" Lily shouted, running into Beatrice's arms. The reunion was too emotional for words. Mother and daughter hugged for long minutes, crying and whispering words of love that echoed off the metal walls of the container. Charles watched the scene with a lump in his throat, realizing he was witnessing the healing of wounds that had seemed impossible to mend. "Mr. Blackwood," Beatrice said when she finally separated from Lily, "I need to apologize for everything that happened." "You have nothing to apologize for," Charles replied firmly. "I'm the one who should have paid more attention to what was happening in my own company." Beatrice smiled faintly. "Oswald is very skilled at manipulating situations. He created a network of dependency where each person involved believed they were protecting something important. The recordings you made, they're all here," she said, showing a flash drive she had kept hidden. "Conversations, documents, transfer receipts, everything we need to expose the entire scheme." Frank approached, him pulling a thick folder from under the bed. "And I spent 2 years gathering additional evidence, city documents, bank records, even photographs of secret meetings." Charles leafed through the documents, impressed by the level of detail in the investigation. "You have enough evidence to prosecute everyone involved, including your sister and the priest," Beatrice said softly. "But we also have evidence that you never knew anything, that you were used as much as any of us." Over the next few hours, the 4 of them carefully planned the exposure of the scheme. Beatrice and Frank had spent months organizing a strategy that would protect the innocent victims while exposing the true culprits. "Carmen can claim coercion," Beatrice explained. "She really was desperate to help her son. We can negotiate her cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence." And Father Joseph? He genuinely believed he was doing good. With the right evidence, he can become an important witness. "And what about the social projects? Hundreds of families depend on them." Frank smiled. "That's already been taken care of. Charles, you have enough assets to keep all the projects running legitimately. In fact, without Oswald's embezzlement, your company will be even more profitable." The next morning, the operation began. Dr. Edward Marks provided medical documentation proving Beatrice's irregular commitment. An honest prosecutor, contacted through Frank, simultaneously coordinated the arrests of Oswald, Dr. Nadine, and the others involved. The network of corruption collapsed in a matter of days. Oswald, confronted with irrefutable evidence, decided to cooperate fully, revealing details that allowed for the recovery of most of the embezzled money. Carmen, as predicted, negotiated a plea bargain that granted her alternative sentencing in exchange for her full cooperation. 6 months later, Charles watched Lily play in the garden of her new home. Smaller but cozy property he had bought on the outskirts of Baltimore. Beatrice, fully recovered from her trauma, had accepted his offer to return to the company, now as chief administrative officer. Frank had retired but lived in a house Charles had built on the same property, spending his days looking after his granddaughter and helping Beatrice with household chores. It was the family none of them had planned, but one that had formed through shared adversity. "You know what impresses me the most?" Beatrice said, joining Charles on the terrace as they watched Lily and Frank planting flowers together. "How something so terrible managed to bring together people who might never have truly known each other otherwise." Charles nodded, feeling a peace he hadn't known in decades. "I spent 50 years building an empire to prove my worth. I discovered that my true worth was in protecting the people who matter." The Hope Foundation had been completely restructured, with Beatrice personally overseeing every project. Father Joseph, cleared of criminal charges, continued to coordinate community activities with renewed enthusiasm. The money recovered from the corruption scheme had been reinvested in social projects, significantly expanding the foundation's reach. Carmen was serving her sentence through community service at the foundation itself, working directly with families in need, while Raphael received treatment fully funded by Charles. The relationship between the siblings was slowly rebuilding, now based on complete honesty. "Uncle Charles," Lily said, running up to him with her hands dirty with soil, "Grandpa Frank said I can plant a big tree in the garden." "What kind of tree?" "One that gives fruit for the birdies," she replied seriously. "Mommy said that when we help others, they help us too." Charles picked her up, feeling grateful for a child who had taught him. Lessons that decades of business success never could. The man who had started this journey, obsessed with control and power, had discovered that true strength came from the vulnerability of loving and protecting other human beings. That night, as he tucked Lily into bed, she asked, "Uncle Charles, are we a real family now?" "Yes, little one," he replied, kissing her forehead. "We are a real family." And for the first time in his life, Charles Blackwood fell asleep, knowing he had found something far more valuable than any business empire. He had found his home. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving it a score from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.